I saw before my eyes something I never imagined. There she was, at a singles party, surrounded by her friends, laughing, without a care in the world. She danced, and for a moment, she seemed so carefree, so happy. That image, however, didn't fit the woman I met so many years ago. My heart was pounding in my chest, a mixture of anger and disbelief. I wasn't there by chance. I had planned every detail of that night. Not to confront her, not to cause a scene. I was already past that phase. My presence there had a clear purpose, to tell her, face to face, that everything was over. The marriage, the home, the promises, everything would fall apart with the words I had prepared. She didn't see me right away. When our eyes finally met, the smile disappeared from his face. The shock in her eyes betrayed what she knew was coming. Perhaps, in some corner of her mind, she had thought that she could continue leading a double life, which I would never find out about. But there, at that moment, there was no longer any way to escape. I walked towards him, feeling the weight of each step, as if gravity wanted to pull me away from that cruel truth. Every detail of that party contrasted with the chaos in my chest. The laughter, the lights, the loud music, none of it made sense. The world around me continued to run like nothing was wrong, but inside me, everything was about to explode. I remember once, when we were at the height of our relationship, how she looked at me, admiringly, with a passion that seemed indestructible. I trusted her in a way I had never trusted anyone. But now that same woman who made me believe in love was there, at that party, with the look of someone who knew she had been caught, but was still speechless. Maybe, just maybe, she was waiting for a chance to justify herself, to explain the inexplicable. The air grew heavy between us as we approached. She opened her mouth, but I stopped her before any sound came out. I didn't come here to hear anything. I just want you to know that I already know everything. My tone was firm, but inside me, anger bubbled. She couldn't say anything, and for a brief second, I saw fear flash across her face. But it was too late. Nothing she said could fix what was broken. Over the past few months, the signs were there. Small clues that, at the time, I insisted on ignoring. The nights out with her friends, the messages she received and quickly deleted, the excuses that seemed increasingly lame. I believed it was just a phase, that the stress of life was pulling us apart, but that everything would return to normal. How foolish I was. How could I be blind enough to not see what was right in front of me? When I decided I would follow her that night, the idea was clear: I needed proof. Something concrete. Something that would destroy any trace of doubt that might still exist. And there was the proof, living and pulsing, before my eyes. I, who before would have done anything for her, now felt like a stranger in my own life. Like someone who had lost control of everything. She didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. The silence between us was broken only by the murmurs of the people around, who noticed the tense atmosphere. But I didn't care what they thought, what they said. The only thing that mattered was that I was finally free from that illusion we called marriage. But before I could pull away, something inside me made me hesitate. There was more there, something I couldn't fully understand. Something in his eyes told me this wasn't the first time. The betrayal I was witnessing now seemed to be just the tip of a much larger iceberg. And then, a distressing doubt settled in me: how long had this been happening? How many men had she gone through while I believed I was the only one? Suddenly, all the memories of our relationship started to play in my mind like a movie. The nights when she said she was tired, the work trips that, at the time, seemed so normal, everything began to take on a new meaning. Every gesture, every apology, every smile I received in return. Nothing seemed true anymore. And that's when the penny dropped: this wasn't the first betrayal. I was faced with a truth that would crush any man. How many times? The question escaped my lips before I could control it. His eyes widened, and it was in that moment that I knew. She tried to look away, but she couldn't. The answer was in his silence, in his fear. This was not an isolated betrayal. It was a pattern. A sequence of mistakes that I never noticed. How could I be so blind? How did she manage to hide it for so long? My chest hurt, not just from what I saw that night, but from what I began to realize I never knew. How much of our life together was a lie? How many times has she looked me in the eyes, sworn her love, while behind there were dark secrets? Every memory, every moment that once seemed meaningful was now just a distorted shadow of what I thought we had. I was ready to leave, to end the night once and for all, but then she finally spoke. And his words, though few, carried more than I was prepared to hear. It wasn't just once. My world stopped. I could feel the air being sucked out of the room, as if everything around me was falling apart. What I had just discovered was much more than a simple betrayal. It was confirmation that my entire life with her had been built on lies. And now, the only question left was, how far did these lies go? How many other secrets did she keep? Welcome to the channel. Here, we never support or encourage any type of betrayal. The stories you will hear are fictional, but they show the harsh reality: betrayal destroys lives, hearts and trust. Get ready, because now you're going to dive into a shocking story, full of emotions and twists that will keep you hooked until the last second. Enjoy the story, but be ready, this narrative will move you. New York was the stage where Ethan and Claire's lives intertwined in an almost cinematic way. He, a focused man, owner of a growing marketing company, has always been known for his determination. Claire, on the other hand, was the epitome of spontaneity. An interior architect, always passionate about art and beauty, she enchanted everyone with her charismatic look and her radiant presence. Their meeting happened by chance, at an art exhibition where she was responsible for the design of the environment, and he had been invited by a mutual client. From the beginning, the connection between them was undeniable. Claire's easy humor balanced Ethan's more introspective and analytical ways. They were a perfect contrast that, at first glance, seemed to complement each other naturally. The relationship grew quickly, with an intensity that surprised both of them. Within a few months, they were already sharing an apartment in a busy neighborhood, where New York nights mixed with the heat of a relationship that seemed indestructible. Claire, with her grandiose gestures, always filled the house with life: lush plants, vibrant colors on the walls, pictures she painted herself. It was impossible not to feel the energy she brought to any environment. Ethan admired that. In Claire, he found a safe haven, someone who softened the edges of his methodical and organized way. He was the kind of man who liked to have everything under control, he planned every step, and Claire came like a light wind, unexpected but always welcome. Over the first few years, the relationship seemed perfect. Each day was a mixture of deep love, mutual understanding, and an all-consuming passion. Ethan saw her as a partner, someone he could build a solid future with, someone who shared his values and his dreams. But, over time, the frenetic pace of the city, work and the demands of life began to put small cracks in what once seemed unbreakable. Ethan began to dedicate himself more and more to the company, seeking growth, new opportunities, but also slowly moving away from the life he and Claire had built. It wasn't for lack of love, he thought, but rather the need to provide, to ensure their future was secure. He believed that Claire understood this, that she also shared this desire for stability. Claire, however, was driven by other forces. She has always believed that there should be more to life than just work. For her, love required presence, constant dedication, and not just words or promises of a bright future. And as the months went by, he began to feel a loneliness that he hadn't felt before. The nights when Ethan arrived late, exhausted, or the times when he simply wasn't there, even when they were together, became more and more frequent. She then began to fill the void in other ways, with her friends, with her work, with short trips to unwind. Claire still loved Ethan, but something in her was beginning to change, a feeling of dissatisfaction that she couldn't clearly define but that was silently growing. The apartment, once a symbol of the couple's happiness, now seemed too big for two people who, despite sharing the same space, no longer connected like they used to. Claire started to get lost in the details of the decoration, changing things here and there, as if by changing the external environment she could solve what was bothering her internally. Every painting she moved, every new color she chose, was, in some way, an attempt to reconnect with the essence of who she was before she felt lost in that suffocating routine. Ethan, on the other hand, didn't realize how much the small absences were weighing on him. For him, it was all a matter of phases. Things will get better, he told himself, we just need to go through this transition time. He was focused on reaching new milestones in the company, believing that once he managed to balance the business, everything would return to normal. But while he lost himself in the numbers, the endless meetings and business dinners, Claire drifted further and further away. Despite this, there were times when memories of what they had together came back with a vengeance. An unexpected dinner, an out-of-season gift, or even a short weekend trip. At those times, it seemed as if their love was invincible, as if time and distance had done no harm. But these moments were increasingly rare, and Claire, who had always been so transparent in her emotions, began to keep her thoughts to herself. She didn't want to confront Ethan. Instead, she waited, perhaps silently, for something that would rekindle the spark between them. Friends noticed the change, but none of them dared to talk about what seemed obvious. There was a gap growing between them. When Claire went out with her friends, she seemed happy, full of life, but those who really knew her saw that something was different. She was smiling, but her eyes no longer had the same sparkle as before. It was as if something was consuming her inside, something that not even she could fully identify. Ethan, in turn, felt guilty, but couldn't put into words what was wrong. He saw the subtle changes in Claire, noticed the distance, but attributed it all to tiredness, to the heavy routine they both led. We'll get through this, he repeated to himself, without really understanding what was at stake. The weekends, which were once sacred to the couple, now passed automatically. Deep conversations were replaced by quick exchanges about everyday life, about banal things. The intimacy that was once natural now seemed forced, as if both were trying to relive something that had already been lost. And amidst it all, there was the underlying feeling that something bigger was coming. Claire, with her silences getting longer and longer, began to look for answers within herself, not knowing exactly what to find. Ethan, blinded by responsibilities, was about to discover that often what isn't said in a relationship is what really matters. The city continued its frenetic pace, indifferent to what was happening in each person's life. On top of the buildings, in the busy streets, love and disappointment walked side by side. And, inside that apartment where so many promises had been made, something was about to change forever. The following weeks passed like a fog. Ethan remained immersed in his work, believing he was in control, while Claire became more distant every day. However, this silent withdrawal was not evident, at least not to him. Words between them were minimal, gestures of affection increasingly rare. But for Claire, the distance became unbearable, even if she didn't express it directly. There was a rising tension that Ethan couldn't decipher. One morning, as he left for work, he noticed something different in Claire's behavior. She seemed distracted, her gaze lost somewhere beyond the horizon, as if she were physically there, but her mind wandered far away, in places he couldn't reach. Ethan tried not to care. Maybe it was just accumulated stress, he thought, the same stress that seemed to engulf them lately. During that week, Claire's absences at night became more frequent. She said being with friends, at dinners or parties helped her relieve tension. At first, he didn't question it. I trusted her. But the repetition of the same alibis began to bother him. The deleted messages, the quick conversations on the phone that stopped as soon as he entered the room, everything began to form a web of small suspicions. It was Friday when Ethan, exhausted after a long meeting, arrived home earlier than usual. The apartment was silent, the lights off except for the dim light coming from Claire's office. He walked in, expecting to find her busy with some other project. But the chair was empty, and the laptop was still open, its screen lit up. The discomfort returned, now stronger than ever. Something was wrong, and he knew it. Instead of confronting her directly, he decided to wait. She had mentioned that she was going out that night with her friends. He told himself he needed to trust, he needed to stay calm. But a restlessness gnawed at his insides. He sat down on the living room sofa and, with his phone in hand, started scrolling through social media. Almost instinctively, he decided to look for Claire's friends, trying to confirm the story that they were together. But the posts he found told a different story. They were in their homes, sharing photos of dinner with their families. Ethan stood up suddenly, as if the weight of the truth was about to come crashing down on him. He took the car keys and left, not knowing exactly where to go. Every minute, his mind swirled with possibilities he'd rather not consider, but which now seemed inevitable. He drove aimlessly through the streets, until, without much thought, he stopped in front of a bar that Claire had once mentioned. That's where she said she met her friends on Friday nights. The place was buzzing, with laughter and music filling the air. He hesitated before entering, feeling a feeling in his stomach that he couldn't ignore. Something inside him screamed that he shouldn't be there, that he didn't want to see what he was about to discover. But he entered, determined. He looked around, searching for her among the people. And then, in the far corner, there was Claire. She laughed, relaxed, but she wasn't alone. Beside her, an unknown man. The closeness between them was undeniable, the subtle touches, the looks they exchanged. Ethan felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. His mind, for a brief moment, refused to accept what his eyes were seeing. He tried to find an explanation that justified that scene, anything other than the obvious. But there was no justification. Claire wasn't with her friends. I was with another man. The truth hit his chest hard, as if the air had been sucked from his lungs. He watched the interaction for a few more minutes, disbelief turning to silent anger. It wasn't just the fact that she was with someone. It was the way she smiled, how light she seemed, free of any guilt or worry, as if that moment was natural, as if he, Ethan, had never existed. For a second, he thought about confronting her right there, about exposing everything, demanding answers. But something held him back. Maybe it was shock, maybe it was the desire to process what was happening before acting. Without knowing exactly how, he found himself back in the car, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. The noise of the city around him seemed distant, muffled by the avalanche of thoughts that filled his mind. Questions began to take shape. Since when was this happening? Who was that man? And why didn't she ever say anything? But the biggest question, the one that hurt the most, was, why didn't he realize it sooner? Ethan drove aimlessly for a long time, trying to make sense of the chaos that was now his life. The images of Claire with that man replayed in his mind like a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. He knew that the confrontation would be inevitable. But how? How could he confront someone he loved, trusted, and now seemed like a complete stranger? The thought of returning home and waiting for Claire, as if nothing had happened, was unbearable. But he needed answers, he needed to understand why it was all happening. He decided to go back to the apartment, sit down, and wait. When she finally arrived, he would be ready. The night wore on, and the tension inside Ethan grew. Each minute that passed seemed heavier than the last, and doubt mixed with pain eroded any remaining patience. Finally, he heard the key in the door. The sound that was once so familiar now sounded like the prelude to something inevitable. Claire entered, apparently calm, not knowing what awaited her. Seeing Ethan sitting in the living room, shock washed over her face for a brief moment, before she tried to hide it with a nervous smile. But there was no more room for disguises. He stood up slowly, his gaze fixed on her, and the tension in the air was palpable. Without words, without direct accusations, Ethan knew she would understand. And, in that uncomfortable silence, everything that had been built between them began to crumble. The betrayal was now exposed. Ethan remained still in the room, piercing silence filling the room. Claire closed the door behind him with a slight click, as if the sound, although minimal, could awaken the volcano of emotions that overflowed within him. She hesitated for a second, as if deciding what to say, what to do. But the words seemed to slip out, and the nervous smile she offered soon disappeared when she noticed Ethan's gaze. "Where were you?" His voice sounded calm, controlled, but there was a rigidity there that couldn't be ignored. Claire hesitated. The initial shock was replaced by an expression of caution, as if he knew that any wrong word could trigger something irreversible. She had always been good at controlling the narrative, at finding quick and efficient excuses, but now she was faced with something different. Ethan's gaze was deeper, as if he already knew the answer. "I went out with the girls, like I told you." She tried to keep her tone light, but the hesitation betrayed her lies. Ethan took a step forward, crossing his arms. Her gaze followed the movement, and he could see the discomfort growing. Claire wasn't good at hiding the truth, not when confronted directly. He knew that. She always fumbled when pressured, and he was counting on it. "The girls?" he said slowly, his voice low. "Interesting, because, apparently, they were all at home." "I saw the posts, Claire." Silence fell again. She blinked in surprise, and the words seemed to fall out of her mouth. She took a deep breath, trying to maintain control, but Ethan already had the upper hand. He waited, feeling the weight of the truth about to be revealed. "Ethan, Claire started, but stopped. She knew there was no point in lying any longer. He took another step, now very close to her. Claire's gaze met his, and for a moment, Ethan saw a flash of regret in her eyes. Maybe it was genuine, maybe it was fear. But at that moment, it didn't matter much. "Who were you with, Claire?" he asked, directly, leaving no room for detours. The voice was a deep but implacable whisper. She looked away, her breathing quickening. Ethan could see the conflict on her face, the internal struggle she was waging. But at that moment, there was no longer any escape. It's not what you think," she finally said, but the words sounded fragile, as if she didn't believe them herself. "Isn't that what I think?" Ethan repeated, with a bitter laugh. "I saw you, Claire. I saw you with him. At the bar. That man. You were." He didn't finish the sentence, unable to say what hurt him so much. Claire's mask began to crumble, her shoulders slumping under the weight of guilt. She knew the truth was about to emerge, and the tension between them was palpable. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice trailing off. I didn't want it to be like this." "Like this?" He took a step back, processing what he heard. "Didn't you want it to be like this? Claire, were you lying to me this whole time?" Anger was now beginning to permeate his voice. She hesitated, unable to find the right words, but Ethan was no longer willing to listen to excuses. He wanted answers. He needed to understand what was really happening. But at that moment, he realized that the hole was deeper than he imagined. "How many times, Claire?" The question sounded heavy, but he needed to know. Her silence was devastating. "How many times has this happened?" Claire took a deep breath, her hands shaking slightly as she tried to control herself. The words she didn't want to say hung between them like a growing shadow. "It wasn't just once, Ethan." The words finally came out, and the impact was immediate. He lay motionless, as if his body had been struck by an invisible blow. The air seemed to have disappeared from the room. "It wasn't just once." The words echoed in his mind, over and over, and he felt an overwhelming mix of anger, disappointment, and disbelief. That was the moment when his life, until then seen by him as relatively under control, slipped through his hands. "How long?" he asked, his voice now low, as if the anger had been replaced by deep emotional exhaustion. Claire bit her lower lip, visibly uncomfortable, but responded. A few months. She confessed, her voice almost a whisper. I didn't plan this, Ethan. I never wanted this to happen, but, things changed between us, you were so distant, and does that justify it? He interrupted, his voice cold. Did you think betraying me would be the solution? She shook her head, tears starting to stream down her face. It's not that. I still love you. But I felt alone. I got lost in the middle of it all. The work, the demands, the expectations, and I found attention. Things I felt like I lost with you. Ethan closed his eyes for a moment, trying to process everything. The pain was suffocating, but he knew he needed to stay calm, needed to move on with this conversation. Who is he? He asked, his voice almost lifeless now. There was no more anger, just a desire to know the truth, the whole truth. Claire hesitated for a moment, as if revealing the name would make everything even more real, even more irreversible. A client. She confessed, her voice trembling. We met on one of my projects. And, things just happened. Ethan laughed bitterly. They just happened. Is that how you describe cheating on your husband? Like something that just happened? She had no answer. There was no way to justify it. Guilt was written in every gesture, in every tear she shed. Why didn't you ever say anything? He finally asked. Why didn't you come and talk to me when you started to feel like things were bad? I tried, she replied, but he shook his head, interrupting her. To try? That doesn't seem like trying, Claire. This feels like giving up. You gave up on me, on us. Silence fell between them once again. The air in the room felt heavier, charged with unspoken truths, with what had been destroyed. And then, in the middle of that painful silence, Claire whispered something that completely changed the direction of the conversation. It's not just him. She said, almost inaudible. Ethan frowned, not immediately understanding what she meant. Like this? He asked, his voice sharper now, demanding an explanation. She looked at him, her eyes red and swollen with tears, but there was something else there. Something darker. Ethan, she began, her voice breaking. It wasn't just once, and it wasn't just with him. Ethan's heart stopped for a moment, and he felt the ground disappear beneath his feet again. Those words, those few words, carried a devastating weight. What? He could hardly believe what he was hearing. There were others. She finally admitted, the words escaping like a poison she kept inside. There were others before him. Ethan felt his world collapsing once and for all. The betrayal he had witnessed was just one part of a much larger network, much darker than he could have ever imagined. Ethan remained silent. The impact of Claire's last words still reverberated in his mind like an incessant wave. The initial shock had given way to a kind of numbness, a feeling of emptiness. He couldn't think clearly. The revelation that it had not been just one affair, but multiple betrayals over time, turned every memory of the last few years into something distant, almost unreal. The man he thought he was, the life he believed he had built with Claire, now seemed like an illusion. Claire, in turn, tried to measure her words, but it was too late. The damage had been done. She was still standing in front of him, her hands shaking, her gaze lost, not knowing how to proceed. He knew that anything he said at that moment could be useless. And the silence between them lengthened, filled with an almost unbearable tension. Why? Ethan finally asked, his voice lower than he intended. He didn't want to explode, he didn't want to lose control, but he also couldn't understand. Why did you continue? Claire sighed, as if the answer had been trapped inside her for a long time, waiting to be released. But how can she put into words something that she herself couldn't fully explain? I don't know, Ethan. She finally responded, almost whispering. I was lost. Every time it happened, I thought it would be the last. That it would come back to you, to us, but then it happened again. And, somehow, it made me feel alive. Her words floated through the air, but they seemed distant, as if you were hearing them from afar, without really taking in the full meaning. Claire spoke of a sense of life, of something missing from her marriage, but Ethan couldn't process how she could have sought it in such a destructive way, so far from the woman he thought he knew. "I gave everything to you," Ethan said, looking at her as if he were seeing a stranger. "I dedicated years of my life, believing that we were building something real. And you were living this lie." Claire recoiled at his words, as if each sentence hit her physically. The pain and guilt she already felt now multiplied with the weight of the accusations, but she knew there was no escape. "It wasn't a lie," she murmured. "At least, not completely. I still love you, Ethan. I never wanted to hurt you." But those words no longer had any force. Not after everything that had been revealed. What did love mean when respect, trust, and loyalty had been broken in such a devastating way? Ethan didn't know anymore. And maybe, at that moment, Claire didn't know either. Love? He laughed, but it was a bitter laugh, without any trace of humor. "How can you call this love? How can you look at me, after everything, and still use that word?" Claire wiped away a streaming tear, her mind struggling to find a path of redemption, a way to fix what seemed hopelessly broken. But Ethan wasn't willing to give it space. "How can I trust you now?" he continued, his voice finally rising in pitch, the pain turning to anger. "How can I believe a word that comes out of your mouth after all this?" "Others, Claire. It wasn't just a mistake. There were multiples." Repeated. She didn't try to defend herself. The damage was already done. Instead, Claire stood there, silent, accepting the truth he was throwing at her. He knew that nothing he said now would erase the decisions he had made, the betrayals he committed, the lies he told. And she knew that, no matter how much she wanted it, she might never be forgiven. "I know I can't undo what happened," she said finally, with a trembling voice. "But please, Ethan, listen to me. I want to try and fix this. I don't want to lose you." He looked at her in disbelief. "Fix this? How to fix something that had been so completely destroyed?" "To repair," he repeated, his voice full of bitterness. "Claire, there's no way to fix it. You destroyed everything. Everything we had, everything I believed in. How do you expect me to just forgive and move on?" Claire lowered her head, without response. "I knew there was no way I could ask for forgiveness for something like that." He knew that the trust between them was irreparably broken. But even so, the fear of losing Ethan forever forced her to try. "I don't know what to say," she admitted, her voice breaking. I just know that I don't want to lose you. And I know I'm the one who caused this, but I would do anything to try to save what's left between us." Ethan closed his eyes, feeling his anger being replaced by a deep sadness. He didn't want to hear those empty promises. I didn't want to see Claire beg for something that was already gone. Because, deep down, he knew that the relationship they had no longer existed. All that was left now were the shards of something that had once been beautiful. "I don't know if there's anything to save," he answered, honestly. "And even if there was, I don't know if I could live with that." Claire sobbed softly, realizing the gulf between them grew with each word. She desperately wanted to find a way to bridge that gap, to regain what she had lost. But how to do this when the weight of your actions was so crushing? "Ethan, please," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Give me a chance. Just one." He shook his head slowly, not knowing what to do. There was a part of him that wanted to give in, that wanted to believe that everything could somehow go back to normal. But another part knew this was impossible. What they had was broken in ways that could never be repaired. The dilemma he faced wasn't just about forgiving Claire. It was about forgiving yourself for ignoring the signs, for trusting blindly, for believing your marriage was safe from the kind of devastation it now faced. And it was eating him up inside. Finally, he pulled away, crossing his arms and taking a deep breath. "I need some time," he said, feeling the weight of his own words. "I don't know what to do now. I don't know if I can go through with this." Claire wanted to protest, she wanted to ask him not to walk away, to resolve this together. But she knew this request would be selfish. She knew Ethan needed that space, even if it meant missing the last chance to make things right. And then, in the painful silence that followed, she saw him leave the room, without looking back. The next few days passed in a blur for Ethan. The apartment that he and Claire had previously shared now seemed too big, too empty. He had left the night of the revelation, needing space, time to process. He went to a hotel, where silence enveloped him, and for the first time, he felt the real weight of what had happened. It wasn't just the betrayal. That's what it represented, the end of a life he believed to be safe, stable. The deconstruction of everything he knew. Claire, on the other hand, stayed in the apartment. Alone, surrounded by memories of the years they had spent together. With each room she entered, she felt guilt enveloping her, suffocating her. She knew she had lost Ethan in a way that might never be recovered. But at the same time, something inside her still fought, a desperate hope that maybe, somehow, there would be redemption. However, the days passed, and Ethan didn't care. He didn't show up. When they finally met again, it was in a neutral cafe, far from the apartment they previously shared. Claire was nervous, but she knew that that conversation would define the final course of their lives. Ethan, on the other hand, was visibly calmer, but the emptiness in his eyes revealed the emotional exhaustion he carried. "Claire," he began, bluntly, "I thought a lot about everything that happened. I thought about us, about who we were and what our relationship had become." She looked at him, unable to say anything, knowing that this was the time to listen to him. "I loved you," he said, his voice low but firm. "I loved you in a way that made me believe we could overcome anything. But this betrayal," he stopped, taking a deep breath. "This betrayal showed me that love alone is not enough. You broke something in me that I don't know can be fixed." Ethan's words fell on Claire like a blow. She had somehow expected him to say there was still a way, that they could try. But deep down, I knew this was a vain expectation. "I understand," Claire finally replied, her voice shaking. "And I know that asking for forgiveness won't change what I did. I know I hurt you in a way that never should have happened." She stopped, trying to control the tears. "But if there's a chance, Ethan, any chance, I'd do anything to try." He looked at her, and in that moment, Claire realized the truth. There was a resolve in his eyes that she had never seen before. "There's nothing else, Claire," he said, softly. "I thought about forgiveness. I thought about what it would be like to try to rebuild. But I realized I can't live with that. And I can't live with you anymore." The silence that followed was heavy, but it also brought a strange feeling of acceptance. Claire, for the first time, realized there was no going back. She had crossed a line from which there was no return. "I'm going to ask for a divorce," Ethan continued, without hesitation. "Not out of revenge, not out of anger, but because it's what's best for both of us. You followed a path that I cannot follow. And now, I need to follow mine." Claire nodded, tears streaming freely down her face. There was nothing more to say. She knew this was the last time they would be together like this, as a couple that had once been full of promise. Now all that was left was accepting the end. The divorce process was quick. Ethan took care of everything in a practical, almost impersonal way. Claire signed the papers silently, knowing that this was the inevitable result of her choices. The apartment was sold, and everyone followed a different path. For Claire, emptiness has become a constant presence in her life. She tried to find solace in her friends, in her work, but nothing seemed to fill the hole she had dug herself. The nights were long, lonely, and she found herself repeatedly going back to that last conversation with Ethan, imagining how different things might have been if she had made other choices. But now it was too late. Ethan, on the other hand, found a strange sense of freedom. Although the divorce had torn him apart emotionally, there was something freeing about starting over, about being free from the weight of a broken relationship. He started to focus even more on his work, on himself. But unlike Claire, he didn't allow himself to be consumed by regret. He knew he had done everything he could to save this marriage, and that betrayal was not something he could bear. Months passed, and life took its course. Claire, now alone, tried to rebuild her life, but regret continued to haunt her. Ethan, in turn, began to see life with new eyes, allowing himself, little by little, to reopen his heart to new possibilities. He knew that the wound caused by Claire would take time to heal completely, but he was determined to move forward. In the end, there were no grand gestures of redemption or dramatic twists. Just two people who followed their paths, each with their own scars. Claire was never the same again. The weight of her choices would follow her for the rest of her life, constantly reminding her that sometimes a single choice can change everything. And Ethan? He found peace. Not immediate, not easy, but real. Claire's betrayal had changed him, forced him to confront his own limits and understand that sometimes the only way to move forward is to leave behind what we love most. Now that you've heard this intense story, leave your thoughts in the comments. What are your thoughts on Claire and Ethan's fate? Do you think they made the right decisions? And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more exciting stories like this. Here, we believe that cheating is something that destroys lives and relationships, and we never support it in any way. Until next time.